joining this week's Conversations on Dress. I'm delighted to be joined by Rebecca Jumper Matheson to discuss her new book titled Artisans and Designers: American Fashion Through Elizabeth and William Phelps, published by Kent State University Press in the CSA series. My name is Kelly Reddy-Best, and I've been a proud member of the Costume Society of America since 2007, and I currently serve as the editor of the CSA series with Kent State University Press. Submissions to the series are open to everyone, and we especially encourage proposals from CSA members, and all manuscripts undergo editorial and peer review, and we welcome inquiries and proposals on any topic related to the history and future of fashion, dress, costume, appearance, and adornment, including historical research, current issues, curatorial topics, contemporary design, construction practices, and conservation techniques. And books in the series range from scholarly to general interest, and from text-based to highly illustrated volumes. For tonight's event, we'll begin with a presentation of highlights from Rebecca's book, followed by a discussion with questions I prepared and time for then audience Q&A. I am so thrilled to introduce tonight's speaker, fashion historian Rebecca Jumper Matheson, author of two previous books in the CSA series, The Sunbonnet, An American Icon in Texas, and Young Originals, Emily Wilkens and the Teen Sophisticate, among other publications. She currently teaches in the Fashion and Textiles Studies MA program at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City. Rebecca, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kelly. Let me tell you about Artisans and Designers. So, my book recovers the story of the life and work of husband and wife design team William Drown Phelps, 1890 to 1962, and Elizabeth Heinges Phelps, 1909 to 1987, and their contribution to American fashion through their leather goods and sportswear firm, Phelps Associates. William and Elizabeth Phelps were critically acclaimed for accessories and sportswear that articulated fashion ideals from patriotism in wartime to simplicity and utility in the 90s and 1960s. The Phelps' accessories designs celebrated handcraft traditions that had persisted despite industrialization in the production of many types of leather goods, while both their accessories and sportswear combated the consumerism of rapid fashion change by emphasizing long-term investment in quality goods. William and Elizabeth Phelps are significant in the history of American fashion for their leather work, which drew on American historical forms and craftsmanship, their experimentation with modes of making beyond mass production, their partnership as a husband and wife design team, their concern with the quality and functionality of materials and end products, their roster of clients that included many celebrities as well as non-celebrities, including people in the fashion industry and media professionals, and Elizabeth Phelps's sportswear designs that gave a consumer base of primarily middle and upper class white women greater sartorial freedom without offending gender norms and notions of propriety. So, for those of you who are fashion historians in the audience tonight, you may have some familiarity with Phelps Associates already. Maybe you know them from this famous Irving Penn photograph, which was taken for a 1950 Vogue article celebrating fashion in the first half of the 20th century, decade by decade. So, this photo was staged with Phelps accessories to represent the American look of the 1940s. Or maybe you know this photo by Louise Dahl Wolfe of a Phelps belt worn with a Claire McCardell diaper bathing suit. Accessories are key to getting the right fashionable look in the 20th century. And once you start looking for Phelps, especially in the 1940s, you'll see them everywhere. So William Drown Phelps was born on September 20th, 1890, in the eastern Pennsylvania coal mining town of Laurel Run. The fashion media celebrated his New England genealogy, his identity as a craftsman, including that he was a descendant of the colonial era Boston metalworker Shem Drown, among other craftsmen, fit well with the fashion industry's goals of creating an American design industry and identity. William Phelps served in the U.S. Navy in World War I and worked as a manager for General Motors. But then during the Great Depression, he lost his job and he switched his focus to craft, starting with woodworking in the early 1930s. Elizabeth Phelps was actually born in Germany on November 27, 1909. Around 1918, her mother was remarried to a U.S. Army officer who was stationed in Germany after World War I. Elizabeth moved to New York City in the early 1930s to pursue a career as an artist, and she studied at the Art Students League. William and Elizabeth, or Jim and Elsie as they called each other, met in New York City in Greenwich Village and were married on New Year's Eve 1934. He was 44 and she was 25. On their marriage certificate, they both listed their occupation as artist. The story of Phelps Associates began with a belt. When asked about the origin of the Phelps Associates business, Elizabeth Phelps recalled, quote, "I just wanted a wide belt. We went to the leather market under Brooklyn Bridge and picked up a piece, and my husband made it for me. Then he made me a few more." End quote. The fashion designer Claire Potter saw and admired Elizabeth's belt and wanted them to make accessories for her upcoming collection. Soon, the Phelpses launched their custom leather goods brand as Phelps Associates, making both belts and bags. In the 1940 census, William and Elizabeth Phelps still both listed their occupations as artist, freelance. Within 2 years, they would build William's hobby of leatherworking into a highly successful and recognized line of custom made and ready to wear women's leather belts and handbags made under the Phelps Associates label, while continuing to view themselves as artists and craftspeople. Besides Claire Potter, the Phelpses would also later acknowledge the well known designers Valentina and Adrian, as well as the custom tweed maker Arthur Falkenstein, for supporting them in their first years of business. Across their careers, the Phelpses were concerned with producing their work in a way that was positive for their artisans, as well as making beautiful, high quality pieces. Their first New York City workshop on Washington Square was a small basement where they worked side by side with the other craftspeople and had lunch every day at a big shared table. The earliest mention of Phelps Associates in Harper's Bazaar is in a 1942 article seen here, Workshop on Washington Square, which described the space as, quote, "a homespun, whitewashed workshop, converted from an 1834 cellar, with wooden tables and workbenches, and a handful of artisans who know the joy of making a thing from start to finish complete." End quote. In their workshop, the Phelpses created made to order belts as well as custom shoulder bags modeled on forms from American military history and adorned with Americana motifs, repurposed horse harness decorations, and other vintage metalwork. One of the early inspirations for Phelps leather goods was horse harness. William and Elizabeth Phelps hired at least one experienced harness maker to work for Phelps Associates, and the influence of this worker's tools, techniques, and familiar forms, coupled with their interest in repurposing metalwork, led to their bags and belts often showing the connection to horse harness quite literally and intentionally. Decorative horse harness, especially for breweries, was one area where leather handcraft had survived in the US, even as other types of leather goods were increasingly machine made and mass produced. Elizabeth Phelps asserted, "I think people are happier making a whole thing, whether it's a whole stove lid or a handbag, than a piece of a thing." End quote. This concept of wholeness and one artisan or maker overseeing an object from start to finish was in direct opposition to William Phelps's experience at General Motors, where assembly line efficiency was the operating model. Many early Phelps accessories incorporated repurposed metal from ornate horse harness, as in these two belts from the museum at FIT, including the heart-shaped buckles and smaller brass shapes. Note that the hearts would have been right side up when worn on the horse. The top belt belonged to fashion editor Sally Kirkland and appears to be custom made, while the belt on the bottom is in ready to wear sizing and belonged to photographer Louise Dahl Wolfe. The book's cover image shows what I consider the quintessential Phelps belt. Here are 3 examples of it from left to right from my personal collection, from the Costume Institute, and the historic Joanna Furnace collection in Pennsylvania. It's a postman shoulder bag modeled on cartridge cases from the American Revolutionary War. Like most of their designs, it was produced in similar form from year to year. So, what does this bag tell us about Phelps? Well, first of all, it's made using leather working techniques, but not a metal frame. So, in the late 1930s, most US women's purses relied on a metal frame for their shape. You can see this in the center in the Evans Case Company bags ad and in the Evans evening bag on the left. But during World War II, metal shortages meant that handbag manufacturers couldn't use this type of design that used so much metal. Wartime Phelps bags, whether oversized or tiny pouches, shoulder bags or belt bags, did not require the metal frame. And there's an example of a Phelps drawstring pouch bag from the Valentine, Richmond, Virginia, on the right. A second way that the Phelpses dealt creatively with metal shortages was reusing military surplus. The brass elements of their bags, from D rings used to attach shoulder straps on a shoulder bag, to decorative elements like the brass American eagle seen on this bag to the left, were repurposed from military gear. They bought these metal pieces in bulk from Army Navy surplus suppliers like the New York based Bannerman Sons. And you can see on the right hand side um, a whole series of storage boxes from the Bannerman store in New York with this type of American eagle for sale alongside U.S. Army buckles. Many Phelps leather goods were inspired also by these forms from American military history. Not only did this blend of historicism and patriotism strike a positive chord with the public and fashion critics, in the early 1940s, the forms were also quite practical. Just as soldiers need their hands free, so did civilian women in wartime. A belt bag or shoulder bag meant that women could carry, say, their own parcels as stores curtailed delivery service. They could carry their own things riding bicycles. They could carry their own things wherever they needed to. With Paris fashions not flowing into the US during the war, the American fashion industry was also concerned with finding homegrown luxury goods to replace those items. Phelps Associates, with its focus on craftsmanship, was poised to offer a custom luxury experience that was made in the USA. Even as they expanded to create non custom pieces, such as belts in standard sizes, they continued to focus on handcraft. Elizabeth and William Phelps also sought to slow down the rapid pace of fashion change by making accessories and later, post war clothing that could be worn for decades. Alongside the American fashion industry's interest in craftsmanship during World War II was a concern that for the duration of the war, the American fashion industry's previous championing of rapid obsolescence would have to give way to promoting fewer, higher quality purchases. In May 1941, Bonwit Teller advertising executive Sarah Penoyer told the fashion group about the necessity of this change in focus. Quote, merchants must do something about selling the public on quality. Quality is the best economy, end quote. To convince the American public to accept this new order in the consumer culture, the fashion industry deployed fashion itself as a tool, arguing that quality and durability were now in style, at least for the duration of the war. The Phelpses' work fit perfectly with this plan. Part of this was emphasizing quality, and part was simply just not changing the designs. It is very difficult, actually, to date Phelps objects because of this. If a design worked well, they continued to keep it in production. For example, one popular design they created was a belt with brass insects. In 1944, Vogue told its readers to treat it as an investment. Quote, buy it as a jewel, magnificent cowhide belt with antique brass bugs, $25, but divide its cost by 5 years' wear, end quote. And there's the picture on the left from Vogue, as well as a detail of an example of one of these surviving belts on the right. One client of Phelps had an accessory set of both the bag and the belt, now in the collection of the Costume Institute. There are quite a few of these belts still around, but the bag is more unusual. Elizabeth and William Phelps received critical acclaim for their work in the early 90s, including a 1944 Coty Award, and that's for their work in the year 1943, alongside sportswear designer Claire McCardle and milliner Sally Victor. The Phelpses donated these examples of their award winning designs to the Museum of Costume Art, now the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The heraldic lion rampant bag and belt had been exhibited in the 1943 Seven American Wars exhibition. They expanded from their basement workshop to a larger workshop over multiple stories of a building a few blocks away on University Place in New York. The new location included workspaces as well as a showroom, which you see here in this photograph. A Phelps custom client entering the New York City showroom at 45 University Place in 1945 would find herself among these displays, presenting a dizzying array of leather goods. By this time, there were about 100 models of belts. Would she choose one of the highly ornamented scalloped belts on the low table, or one of the simpler belts hung on a stand? In the glass cases, samples of some of the 75 different models of Phelps bags were available, with shoulder bags hung from wall pegs and belt bags arranged flat on shelves. Custom clients paid from $14.50 to $85 for bags and from $3.50 to $35 for belts. But still, the high-end specialty stores that carried Phelps Associates wanted more goods than they were able to produce. In 1945, William and Elizabeth Phelps purchased historic Joanna furnace, a 19th century iron furnace in rural Berks County, Pennsylvania, moving their home and some of their production there. On the right, you see the old ironmaster's mansion, which they renovated themselves as their new home. But before fully completing the move, they started a new project with the backing of specialty stores such as Neiman Marcus and Bonwit Teller in the nearby small town of Birdsboro. The Birdsboro workshop, seen on the left, would still feature hand production of a single piece from start to finish by the same artisan, but would only produce simpler and fewer designs. The more complex and custom pieces would continue to be made in the main workshops in Joanna Furnace. They kept the finances of these two different models separate. After World War II, the Phelpses were thinking about other ways that they could expand their business while still being true to their vision. Women's clothing was one avenue for expansion. They started with custom made aprons as early as 1944 and then skirts. Vogue's October 1948 issue included this skirt in an article about made in the USA custom garments. Quote, made of cotton, tough awning cotton, made to order, no two ever precisely alike, end quote. Vogue's editorial commentary here focuses on the paradox of tough luxury. The skirt is a luxury good due to its uniqueness as a custom made garment. Yet at the same time, Vogue calls attention to the humble materials used durable cotton sailcloth. The next month, in November 1948, Vogue featured a series of Elizabeth's signature aprons over pants. The apron over pants look was a compromise between her desire for the functional features of trousers for outdoor activities and William's views about trousers for women. Elizabeth later wrote, quote, when my husband and I moved to rural Pennsylvania after having lived in New York City for many years, I became very unhappy about my clothes. They consisted of what I then considered suitable country wardrobe, freshly starched shirts and skirts. Occasionally, when we were alone, I wore blue jeans, but Jim didn't really approve of these for working hours or trips to the local village. Then, while we were puttering around the workshop one day, I saw some bright turquoise sailcloth we were using for summer bags. I decided to make an apron. Jim liked my idea of wearing it over my jeans, and I felt very neat in its bright, pleasant color. During the days that followed, I made more aprons. Then I dyed some of the old army slacks of Jim's to match. After that, I began making neater looking trimmer slacks, and a new costume was born. I loved it and I lived in it all day long, end quote. And Vogue's article showed Elizabeth modeling her hunting apron, gardening apron, fishing apron, and even a dog washing apron, shown with their Dalmatian Joanna, or Jo for short, who was named for the furnace. The positive response to the Vogue article demonstrated that there was enough interest for Phelps to produce clothing, and they launched the Phelps Deep Country Clothes ready-to-wear line, primarily designed by Elizabeth. A June 9, 1949 newspaper clipping shows a photograph of 8 of the 36 models from their first fashion show, posed as chatting pairs, lined up outside the exterior wall of the Joanna Furnace mule stable, The mule stable actually housed the Phelps workshop. The women are wearing various ensembles from the deep country clothes line, including jumpers, skirts, and blouses, and, of course, the apron over pants combination. The clothes are accessorized with wide Phelps leather belts and bags. And on the right, you see the mule stable today. And in the center is an example of the Phelps Deep Country Clothes label. Even as the Phelpses launched Deep Country Clothes, they were feeling a financial pressure. They had always aimed actually for just modest profits rather than profit maximizing, and had poured much of that profit back into the business. When Bethlehem Steel offered to buy the Joanna Furnace property, they accepted, with the sale finalized in 1951. They moved their home and their business south to an area just outside of Asheville, North Carolina, called Skyland. There, they relocated the workshop, which would stay there until Elizabeth wound down the business in 1969. In the last reiteration of the business, they would incorporate, and the business became known as Phelps Enterprises and later Phelps Industries. They would continue to produce ready to wear clothing and leather goods, and would sometimes produce small batch orders for other firms, even Abercrombie and Fitch. These two circa 1956 skirts from the Valentine are from this North Carolina era. Phelps clothing, both ready to wear and custom, often featured wrapping and tying features. The skirts go completely flat for easy ironing. Also, many pieces are reversible, giving multiple ways to wear them, as in this ensemble sold at Lord and Taylor's country clothes shop. The blouse also features another Phelps signature, Scoville gripper snap fasteners. William Phelps passed away on January 20th, 1962, and Elizabeth continued running the business single handedly for the rest of that decade. In the 1960s, we see surviving examples of trousers that were not meant to be worn with an apron over them. During this time, it became more socially acceptable for women to wear trousers out in public. And this example comes from the North Carolina Museum of History. The trousers do have a zipper closure, but they also have her favorite snaps. They have large belt loops wide enough to accommodate one of those really wide Phelps leather belts. And the same thing is true of this pair of shorts from around the same time. By the close of the 1960s, though, Elizabeth Phelps retired, turning first to work as a consultant for Hanes. And then in these last few years of her life, her artistic interests came full circle with a return to painting before she died in 1987. William and Elizabeth Phelps are pictured here on their front porch at Joanna Furnace in a 1945 portrait by Walker Evans. The Phelpses believed that both materials and labor were an important aspect of value. They cared about materials, whether leather or fabric. However, they cared equally about the ways their designs were produced and the quality of life of the people who worked for them. Long before sustainability was an industry buzzword, the Phelpses defied the frantic pace of fashion obsolescence by crafting objects that were meant to be investments, collected over time, and worn for years, as well as celebrating the people who made the objects and the process of making.
Thank you, Rebecca. Oh my gosh, that was such a wonderful presentation. So, thank you for sharing your wonderful insights and just highlights of
Mhm.
the book. I highly recommend
Mhm.
reading the entire book front to back. So, I'll begin our conversation tonight with a few questions about your work and then we'll open it up to the audience. So, my first question is what inspired you to tell the story of William and Elizabeth Phelps and how did you first encounter their work?
Well, in my previous book on Emily Wilkens, I was looking at a lot of material from the 1940s, and I just kept running into the Phelps's work over and over. And once I became aware of it, like I said in the presentation, I just saw it everywhere. Not just in winning the Cody Awards, but so often they would be the ones called in to accessorize when there was a fashion show happening. And their work appeared in all kinds of magazines from fashion magazines to also magazines like Life. So they really got a lot of coverage and they were really well known in the 1940s. And I was surprised I didn't know more about them. So I just became really curious and started looking. And that's really kind of what touched off my research.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I felt after until I read your book, until I was reading it as you were going through the process, I thought, "Oh my gosh, I must have seen this so much
Mhm.
before," and I didn't realize
Mhm.
how much of a contribution they had, and it was yeah, so now I'm kind of on the lookout
Mhm.
whenever I'm in the archive or looking at story
Yeah.
magazines and old copies of stuff because I feel like I'm gonna just see the
Mhm.
bug bell or something,
Yes.
and then I'll know.
Yeah.
So the Phelpses, they, obviously in your presentation, they emphasize craftsmanship. And also they had a lot of historical references in their designs. And so how do you think their approach resonates with today's fashion values? Especially you mentioned again, there's like this emphasis on
Mhm.
sustainability and slow
Mhm.
fashion. And how do you think that resonates with folks today?
Yeah, so I think one way is just the reuse. I mean, the idea of taking the pieces and kind of upcycling them into something else. I think that's one thing that definitely resonates for today. And I think also the idea of making of purchase, but then doing so with the idea that you're going to be keeping it long term. So, the pair of trousers that I showed towards the end, those were worn by, someone who worked in the fashion retailing and kept them long enough that, in the book I go into it more in detail, but they were repaired after they had been worn out, like, in the crotch area. So wear and tear of like wearing it over and over and over. This is someone who has access to lots of new fashion and yet chose to repair and continue reusing these trousers because they're just so great. Other examples, some of the things that, are in museum archives today, museum collections, it's because the people who owned them wore them and kept them for so long. And then sometimes at multiple generations. And that's another thing that I talk about in the book is how some of these objects were used and treasured in the 1940s, saved and passed down to another generation of women of the 1960s who also wanted hands-free shoulder bags or a hands-free belt bag, even if it was just to like slip your key in the belt bag before you're going out to a 1960s nightclub. The objects were still beautiful and ready to be used again. So I think that really resonates with the idea of stepping away from fashion, fast fashion and disposable fashion to hanging on to things longer term. And finally, just the fact that they wanted to slow the pace of fashion change instead of coming out with totally different models every season or changing a line so that what was in style 2 years ago suddenly looks so wrong now. The Phelpses tried to keep a pretty consistent line all the way through. So, for example, even a Phelps skirt from the late 1960s, it's still made in exactly the same wrapping and tying techniques as things that were done in the 1940s. It's just a lot shorter. Um, but they really made that change very slowly. So I think that's another thing, another way to kind of push back on disposable fashion. It's just not changing the design so often. So yeah, that's definitely one way.
Yeah, and that quote too, where the investment, think about it
Mhm.
as 5 years. I thought, "Oh my
Mhm.
gosh, I should think about that."
Mhm. Yeah,
I was like,
and
"When
that's
I'm
even
shopping, that's what I'm gonna do."
and that's from Vogue, like telling people that. And during the World War II era, it was really important that the fashion industry encourage consumers to keep things longer term. But the Phelpses continue that even into later decades. And in fact, even with some of the sportswear, magazines will even still talk of even in the 1950s, which is all about the changing, this year we need this year we need that. But within Phelps, they were considered, something that you collected over time. And magazines even use that word for all the Phelps collectors out there. Here's the new skirt, here's the new whatever. So there's still that idea that Phelps is something really classic and that you're going to keep it and you're going to keep wearing it.
Amazing. So Elizabeth's role evolves pretty significantly over time. So what do you think her story revealed about women's contributions specifically to American
Mhm,
fashion and also entrepreneurship in the mid 20th century? And so you mentioned some of those things, but what
mhm.
else what else do you think were her major contributions in those kinds of ideas?
Yeah, so I'm really interested, again, tying it kind of to my previous book about Emily Wilkens. That was another woman entrepreneur who had both business and artistic control over a fashion line. And it's a similar thing with the Phelpses, where you have a woman who's not just doing the artistic part, but having no input into the business. There's not a division like that that I have seen in the Phelps's work. And then you see her finally running the business, basically by herself at the end of her career. But it's interesting because a lot of it is how their working relationship is portrayed in the media over time too. In the 90s, there's a lot of push in some magazines to kind of describe it as, oh, she's just a helper. She's just his helper. But then they seem more willing to acknowledge her contribution when she's working in clothing. So there's a real gendered thing about leather work versus something involving sewing fabric, which is very interesting. But from what I've seen, it appears that they both kind of work on things together and they have input. Even if they're not physically stitching the thing, they're working and sharing ideas and they're talking about this back and forth about even much later in life. They see something on the beach and they're talking together about the colors. And there's a letter surviving that they describe this kind of back and forth that they have. So they seem to have a real working partnership. Um, and yet, she does eventually kind of take on this leadership role by herself in the 1960s and, seems to do it. And the real tension there that I see is for a lot of people who really are artists and would prefer to be being an artist rather than running a business. And yet, if you run your own business, you have more artistic control. So it's sort of this cycle, like you have to find the balance. Like, what's the right balance of like having the power and the agency to run my own business and be able to do the thing that I want to do artistically at the same time. So I think you really see that in her life.
Yeah, it was kind of incredible, yeah, to see, like,
Mhm,
how she evolved over time and
mhm,
how involved she was,
mhm.
especially during that time frame.
Yeah.
Were the Phelps's looks, were the Phelps looks always appreciated as classic and timeless, in eras such as the 70s and 80s? Did you, able to kind of look at that time period at
Mhm.
any part of your research?
Well, in the 70s and 80s, they really have closed down the business. So, like in the early 70s, like, so 1969 is kind of the official end, but there's still some things being shown in the early 70s in Vogue. Again, like some of those, it's an apron over pants look, but it's like a very short little, almost peplum little apron over trousers that's being shown in that period. So, it's still appearing in Vogue right up to the end of the business. But then in the early 70s, she basically auctions off everything, including the leftover fabric, her own, antiques, everything must go kind of thing. So she auctions off everything and the workshop passes to another manufacturer. So at that point, really they're kind of done officially after she really winds things down and then she's more focused on her painting. She goes back and starts doing lots of bird paintings. She's like a big bird watcher. She has a whole room set up with a big plate glass window so she can watch birds and, birding books underneath. And so she really kind of shifts focus at that point. But certainly up until I would say from 1940s through to the early 70s, they seem to have a kind of consistent following. Even as other things kind of go in and out, certainly within their country clothes sphere and within that realm of accessories, I think they do have a very classic look that continues to be shown in some of those country clothes shops within department stores and specialty stores. They kind of have a consistent business.
So you received the Stella Blum Student Research Grant in 2020. Can you tell us about how that perhaps aided your research?
Yeah, I am so thankful. The Stella Blum grant was an amazing opportunity. So, if there's any students watching tonight, I will just put in the plug. Please apply and fill out the forms to do that because it's really a wonderful grant that enabled me to do some of the travel. It was 2020, so it was a difficult year for trying to do travel and research. But the grant enabled me to go out to Pennsylvania to Joanna Furnace. I really thought I was just going to go see the space. I just wanted to see that mule stable where they worked. I wanted to just be able to walk in there and kind of experience what it would have been like to be within the Phelps space. And then when I went, it turned out that they had just received this gift of an accessory set that had belonged to Hart, who worked for the Phelpses. one of those quintessential postman bags that I showed, one of those was hers, and she actually worked as a teenager in their, in their house helping out, and then worked in the other part of the business. And she had her own Phelps accessories set, and I got to see and study that in the mule barn where they worked. And so, I mean, thank you to CSA for the Stella Blum grant for that. And then on top of it, also with Stella Blum grant funds, I went down to North Carolina. And again, at the North Carolina Museum of History, I was the first person to come in to do research in the midst of COVID. So they were so kind and created a new protocol. They brought the trousers upstairs to an event space so that I could study them in person. And again, studying the trousers in person was so important with seeing those use patterns, um, seeing like how they had been worn over and over. So getting to study them in person there was really important. And the Stella Blum grant is part of what made that all possible. So I am super thankful for that. And I think that traveling to see both the spaces and the objects was a really key part of my research. So I'm just super thankful and grateful for CSA making that possible.
Yeah, that's incredible that you went to both places and could see all those objects and then had that amazing experience seeing the
Mhm.
objects in Pennsylvania. So yeah, I'll go to Annette's question next. So Annette writes, this research seems particularly relevant today, especially with craft-centric conversations associated with the US's 250th anniversary and pushes for, quote, made in America. What are your thoughts on how best to make sense of the romantic and often idealistic ways that this duo presented American identity and pre industrial craft practice?
Yeah, so I think they kind of engage with it in a way that's happening over a lot of the interest in American design. So you definitely have to situate it within what's happening in the 90s with things like the Index of American Design, where due to some of the New Deal programs, artists are being sent out all over the country to sketch these amazing color sketches of all kinds of things that fall in the sort of idea of folk art or American historical pieces, with the whole idea that these things are going to be used to craft a new American design identity, that somehow some of these things that are very old are also very modern at the same time. The Phelpses are involved in that. In fact, William Phelps was involved with teaching in the Civilian Conservation Corps. He was involved with doing surveys of craft. So they're very much coming from this kind of movement, at the same time that they are actually then trying to start a business. So they're running the business and they actually have to make a lot of practical decisions as well as to the idea of sort of romanticizing things. They also have to deal with the nuts and bolts of actually running a business on a daily basis. So I think one of the things that's really interesting about them is the way that they negotiate that and the way they continue to try things that are in a different way. Um, you know, like it may sound really great to work in that basement in Washington Square, that's the 1830s basement. And if you live in New York and have ever been to the Merchant's House Museum, for example, you can go down to this little kitchen basement. That's one of the few that's preserved in New York. It's very romantic, but when the business grew, if they wanted to grow the business, they had to change their working style and they had to move into a more contemporary building, which then meant things were split over multiple floors. So I think that's one of the ways that they really their story gives kind of a great reality check as well as just being inspired by the ways that you can figure out a way to make something by hand even in the midst of the push to mass produce. So I think they really walk that line in an interesting way, and I think that's part of what I've brought out from their story. That's part of what I've found most interesting to learn.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Moya asks, they said, I noticed that one of the handbags had the same or similar closure as what Bonnie Cashin used for Coach. Do you know if they knew each other or worked together?
So that's a really interesting piece, and I talk about this just a little bit, but Bonnie Cashin is really known for her work with sills, but before Sills hired Bonnie Cashin, Elizabeth Phelps worked for them for 2 years. So Bonnie Cashin's immediate predecessor at Sills was Elizabeth Phelps. So because they had already been doing a lot of things that combined leather and fabric in their bags, she was brought in and did a lot of leather work, garments, as well as accessories for Sills. And so it's really interesting to think about, what might have been. I don't have any specific evidence of, you know, how much did they know each other? What happened? Why did Elizabeth leave after 2 years? It was a side project for her. She was doing it while still being involved with the Phelps Associates business, designing ready to wear under her own label as well as working for Sills. So it's really interesting to think about that, but I don't know exactly, but I just know that, she worked there first and then Bonnie Cashin came in. So there certainly could be some, overlap or some influence, but I don't know exactly what that would have been.
No letters back and forth in the archive there.
Doesn't mean it's not there. We just haven't found it yet.
All right, and I'll also ask Margaret's question. So she wrote, how many artisans were employed in Pennsylvania and then in North Carolina?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know exactly the numbers. The New York workshop was fairly small at first, so they only had about 5 people originally. In Pennsylvania, they had 2 workshops going, so I don't know how many were in Birdsboro versus how many in the actual Joanna Furnace piece. And then again, I think they had about 30 people in North Carolina. And in some of the newspaper articles in North Carolina, they spell out the names of people. They list a lot more people by name in the North Carolina thing because it's like a local newspaper covering. So there's a lot more like this person is now the metal worker because by the end of the 60s, they were actually like making their own metal work as well as using vintage pieces. And sometimes they were copying the vintage pieces when it was running out. As well as making new things. So we find out, oh, so and so is the foreman, so and so is the metal worker, so and so is cutter. Like you actually hear that, but I don't have a precise number for how many were actually working in Pennsylvania at a given time. I just haven't found the actual facts about that.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and it's interesting, yeah, thinking about the smaller New York, because you were mentioning that small, if you go into the
Mhm.
basement, very small area, and then they, grew out. So, yeah, really interesting. All right, going back to one of my questions. So there's a lot of really fascinating, really cool objects and archival materials in your project. Was there a particular item or artifact that surprised you or changed your understanding when you first
Mhm.
encountered it or when you were examining it?
So one that kind of pops to mind right away is in the Mule Barn when I was looking at Helen Hart's accessory set. A lot of times in the magazines, you see, like in that Irving Penn photo, that the bag was meant to be styled with string gloves, so like a knitted type glove. And the pocket on the front of the bag is where you can kind of put your glove in. And so, but it was always portrayed as this is something appropriate for the country. So you would want, this kind of glove to wear with it. And when I was studying the Helen Hart set, I looked inside Helen Hart's bag, and instead of like those string type gloves, there was a pair of formal white daytime gloves, such as you would wear for a formal daytime occasion, like going to church or something. And I thought, okay, so this tells me something new about how everyday women may have worn this in a way that pushes back against the fashion etiquette that is being advocated by fashion magazines. So, fashion magazines may be telling you an ideal or what they think, and maybe that ideal is followed by some people or some groups, but it doesn't mean that everyone is using their objects in that way. And I thought it was really interesting to find out that for someone who had been a Phelps worker, someone who had actually been a part of the business, that the Phelps accessory set might actually be something formal. Um, something that they use for best. And I thought that was a really interesting piece that like people use it in different ways.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, really interesting. Of course, fashion magazines portray what we think we might look like. On the topic of interesting objects, did you have a favorite object that you came across?
Well, I do have to say that I think that that classic bag is probably my favorite. Um, just because it is done in so many different ways. Appears so many times, and I think it tells so much about what they were interested in and what they were trying to do. And, all of those Postman bags have an American eagle either. They have all kinds of other decorations. It's just that eagle was really popular in World War II, and it kind of struck a chord in that moment. But they decorated with them with, like, engineers insignia and all kinds of other things. So it's pretty interesting to see those. I think that that postman bag is one of the most interesting objects, I think. It kinda sums them up for me.
Yeah, it's a gorgeous bag. Skylar Rowe, excellent presentation.
Thank you,
Um,
Skylar.
and then was there anything you uncovered in your research that surprised you?
I think I was probably most surprised by what I learned about leatherworking and the historic tanning industry in New York. So when they talk about making that that first belt, they talk about going to the historic leather area under Brooklyn Bridge. And so I actually did a whole side project, and only a little bit of that is, really relevant to the book and really relevant to them. But there is a whole series, like in the 19th century and before, of leather working, leather making, all of that in that particular very small neighborhood called the Swamp. And a lot of it was just wiped out when they put in the Brooklyn Bridge. So there was a lot of back and forth about whether even to put in the Brooklyn Bridge right in that place. So that was kind of a surprise, was learning about that being something that existed even in New York City, and just seeing how they then position themselves even in when they're talking, oh look, we're a part of this historical practice. And they sort of position themselves within New York history as well as craft history. So that was an interesting piece. Yes.
And then Moya asks, do you know if those Postman bags were ever copied by other companies at the same time or later?
Definitely. I have definitely run across some other bags that are, um, kind of have a little bit of a similar look, often maybe even have like an eagle put on them. Usually not quite as nice in the construction. One of the things that I thought was interesting, because the Phelpses were really interesting and they call it engineering, but trying to do something to make sure that the bag stays on the body. So with the shoulder bag, it's very easy for it to just slip off the shoulder. And the way they position the straps, putting them on the back of the bag rather than the sides of the bag, it actually kind of helps hold it in position on your body. And so that I thought that was an interesting piece. So I haven't seen that as much in some of the copies, but yes, they're definitely, and also, I mean, just shoulder bags in general were very popular in 1940s. So there are lots of people making shoulder bags in this moment. So it's definitely something that's not like there's plenty of overblown language in the fashion press about them inventing the shoulder bag, which of course they do, they're just one of many creators of shoulder bags, but I think they do it really well.
So, one last question. If readers take away one idea or feeling from this book, what
Mhm.
would you hope that would be?
Well, I just think it's really interesting the way they keep experimenting with different ways of doing things. That they don't get discouraged when one way doesn't work. They just try something new, and the way they keep doing it in a way that keeps their ideals front and center. And so, for example, when they collaborate with all those specialty stores that want them to produce more, 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 and they just can't make enough, they keep that separate, and they do it in a way, and they actually issue stock certificates in a way that made sure that they still are in charge, that it doesn't affect their custom business, and that the stores won't be able to put pressure on them to maximize the profit even then. So I just think that they take what skills they have, including in business as well as artistically, and they do that to try different ways of how are we going to do this? Just because this is how the fashion industry does things generally, that doesn't mean we have to do it this way. Let's see what else is possible. So I think that sense of trying something different and the sense of the possible, I think is something that I really take away from this research, and I hope that readers will take that too.
Yeah, it's a great example of artists engaging in capitalism and remaining
Mhm,
true to themselves
mhm,
while engaging in that system
mhm.
that's very difficult.